The Driller is probably one of the most interesting and unique classes in the game. He loves his elemental effects, and today we're going to focus on one of them to help eradicate everything in the cave with this very satisfying Driller build. For many people, the Driller class is a rather confusing and tantalizing class to attempt to use. There are just so many ways that he can be outfitted to be used in the field that it can feel a little bit overwhelming sometimes, and most of them are rather unconventional compared to the simple, smooth-brained playstyles of the other classes that they tend to stick with. For today, we're going to explore a build that I put together that focuses on the Driller's freezing power as well as his ability to mine resources that makes the Scout self-conscious about his position in the team. So without further ado, here is the affectionately named Mr. Freeze build for the Driller class in DeepRockGalactic. By the way, if you want to see more build videos or just more videos in general, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another upload.
Fueled up and raring to go.
So this build is one that Driller players will definitely enjoy, especially if they are a fan of freezing things. The idea behind this build is to, well, freeze things a lot.
Really?
Turning the bugs into bug sickles and then shattering them into a million pieces for not only extremely satisfying results, but also near infinite sustainability thanks to our perks and mods setup. You'll be in the thick of the enemy action, spewing slushy at all things bug before taking out your trusty drills or pickaxe and going full barbarian on any frozen target in front of you. Naturally, this calls for our trusty engine of ice, the Cryo Cannon, to be our primary weapon. A gun that requires no introduction, it does one thing and one thing only, which is to freeze all organic matter it touches. Combine this with our Swiss Army knife of secondary weapons, the Experimental Plasma Charger, or EPC for short, and you have a glorious combination of deep freeze ice crystals and superheated plasma for all of your wildest dreams. So now let's get into the actual gameplay of this particular build and how it's meant to be used. The main goal of this build is to have very effective crowd control as well as full health almost constantly, turning you into a nearly unkillable machine, keyword nearly, and have potential for some very strong both burst and sustained damage. To no one's surprise then, our choice of primary weapon is the famous Cryo Cannon, the weapon that is most likely Mr. Freeze's wet dream. This thing is the cornerstone of the build as it fuels the primary rotation of how this build works. The main thing this weapon does for us is to of course freeze enemies solid, preparing them for the next step of the process, wherein which we either use power drills, throwing axes, or just our trusty pickaxe to shatter them into pieces and keep ourselves alive. To help with this process, our overclock of choice is the tuned cooler to further increase our freezing power and efficiency, upping the rate at which we are able to freeze enemies effectively. To complement the Cryo Cannon, we are using one of the Driller's most useful secondary weapons, the Experimental Plasma Charger. This thing has several different uses for us, but the main two things we use it for are, number one, for dealing with those smaller fodder enemies that we can't be bothered to take out, and number two, to mine those hard to reach minerals quickly. The EPC has a lot of ways that it can assist with damage and utility. To aid in our cause, there are two potential ways you can go in terms of overclocks. First, if you want to keep it simple, you could use the magnetic cooling unit just to help you out with efficiency, especially if you are leaning into using the EPC for mining. But if you want to be a little bit more spicy, then you can try running the persistent plasma for some more AoE coverage and add a little bit more flair to the gun's damage. Again, the main bulk of encounters you will be using your Cryo Cannon to eliminate bugs, and the EPC will be there to back you up or to fill your pockets when needed. For your equipment in this build, our satchel charges are going to be used for more damage and stuns instead of leveling dirt. So make sure not to use all of them in trying to blow up the Scout, and save at least a few for incoming swarms. As for drills, you'll be cutting the time that you use them in half, with 50% to be used for digging and 50% to be used for shattering enemies. So make sure to know when is the most appropriate time for which. So now going into the actual build, first we have our perk choices. This build has a very specific playstyle, and the perks here are very important for us. For passives, the first mandatory perk requirement is Vampire, as this is going to be how we sustain ourselves in the field. Once we freeze those enemies solid, we cleave through them with either our power drills or axes, will proc Vampire and give us a burst of healing. This is stupidly powerful, and as such we cannot ignore it. The second perk we are running is Resupplier. This is just a nice way to keep us armed and healthy when hitting the resupply pods and keeping us healthy as well. The last slot is kind of a flex spot and it's up to you, but I'm just running Thorns for the reason I always mention about keeping the pressure off of us from smaller bugs. For active perks, Iron Will is another mandatory choice, as it will literally bring us back from the dead, and when combined with Vampire, is a one-stop shop for survival. The other option is again up to you, but something like See You in Hell would be fun, or even just Dash is another good option as well. Now getting into the core setup of the build with the weapons and equipment, we are going to start with our throwable grenade. For this build, there is no other option that works better than the throwing axes. Not only do they do phenomenal damage on their own, but they combo insanely well with both the freezing effects and our vampire perk. You can get some fast bursts of healing by spamming them at a swarm, or for those stronger enemies, once they're frozen, they do even more damage. Moving on to the actual weapons and their upgrades, our primary weapon is the aforementioned Cryo Cannon. The slushy shooter is a main source of damage of this build, as well as a strong form of crowd control, making the enemies brittle and crushable, not even just for us, but the entire team. To make it even more effective, our choice of overclock is the Tuned Cooler. Using this makes our freezing power stronger at the cost of slightly worse pressure management, a small price to pay for frozen annihilation. To improve the Cryo Cannon even more, in the first tier I went with a larger pressure chamber to help with the ammo management. You could also go with the faster turbine spin up and it would achieve a similar effect, but for me this one felt a little bit more comfortable. Moving over to the second tier, I chose the overclocked ejection turbine for more range. The range is in my opinion the hardest part of using the Cryo Cannon, so I want to improve it as best I can. The third tier, I went with the increased flow volume for a faster flow rate, which essentially means a faster rate of fire. This helps us get even more cold damage out faster and freeze the bugs solid almost instantly, making our job much easier. In the fourth tier, I kept it simple and chose the larger reserves tank to give us even more ice to freeze enemies with. You could also go with the supercooling mixture if you want to lean even further into the freezing power if you wanted to. Then lastly, in the fifth tier, this one comes down to a bit more personal preference, but I like to take the Cold Radiance because I feel like it fits a little bit better into our build. Since we are going to be extremely close proximity to the enemies and want to shatter them as many as possible, it also allows us to sometimes freeze enemies that we aren't even directly firing at. Moving over to the EPC, our purpose for this weapon is to clean up swarms and smaller enemies that we can't get any benefit from Vampire or the rest of our kit, as well as mine those hard to reach minerals to further enforce the rivalry between the Driller and the Scout. First, talking about the overclock choice, again we have a few choices, but for this I wanted to do something spicy and try one that I haven't tried too much before with the Persistent Plasma. This causes charge shots to leave behind a lingering plasma field that damages anything in the area at the cost of some damage. This can help with some certain crowd control situations and give us some good damage on more stationary targets. To further improve the EPC, in the first tier I chose the larger battery for more ammo. The extra damage isn't insanely important since this isn't our main damage dealing gun and we mainly want our shots for cleanup and mining. On that note, on the second tier I chose the Overcharged Plasma Accelerator, and this is mainly because I just have a hard time leading the slow moving shots on this thing, so this helps me out personally. But if you wanted to go with the Heat Shield, that wouldn't be a bad option either. In the third tier I am using Improved Charge Efficiency just to make sure I'm not burning through ammo too fast. Really any choice here is fine and will do you well, but this is just for me personally. I like not burning through a whole lot of ammo since again our overclock wants us to be charging up frequently. In the fourth tier, I went with the expanded Plasma Splash to give us more AoE on our charged shots. More AoE with our setup means more damage, more mining, and just in general more plasma, which is what we want. Finally, in the last tier, we went with the legendary and pretty much needed Thin Containment Field. If you are unaware, this mod lets you shoot at a charged projectile to cause it to explode and cause a large area damage that not only does great damage, but is also what allows us to mine minerals since the area of effect it creates can cause minerals to drop to the ground. It's a little tricky to get the hang of, but once you do, you will question why you are even bringing the Scout onto the team at all. Lastly, briefly going over the upgrades for the rest of the Driller's equipment, for the Satchel Charge we have a pretty simple choices. In tiers 1 and 3 we took extra charges to use them more often, Kill Switch is the only option in tier 2, and we are taking Concussive Blast for the stun effect in tier 4 to use these charges offensively. For the Driller's arms we are taking Barbed Drills in tier 1 for extra damage, Streamlined Integrity Checks in tier 2 in case we overheat, Supercharged Motor is the only option in tier 3, and lastly we have Bloody Coil Drills to get even more benefit from drilling enemies. Finally, in our armor rig, we have the Improved Generator at tier 1 to get our shields back faster, Healthy in tier 2 to make us more durable, Hazmat System is the only option in tier 3, and lastly we are actually using Static Discharge in tier 4 to help apply an AoE stun effect to nearby enemies if we do get in trouble. So giving my final thoughts on this build, first, this is not obviously the most meta and well-designed build in the entire world, and will you be able to take this into Hazard level 5 content? Probably not unless you're really good. But that being said, it is an incredibly fun build to use, and honestly, those are the ones that I like better anyway. It is also a build that requires a good amount of comfort with being very close to the enemy bugs. As such, it is very satisfying when it works out properly. You'll be very effective at controlling and deleting large groups of enemies, and softening up stronger, more dangerous threats will be just as simple. If you like being the embodiment of ice and turning the entire battlefield into a frozen war zone, then the Mr. Freeze build is perfect for you. Well, there you have the Mr. Freeze build for the Driller, and hopefully you Frost mages out there will enjoy it. By the way, before we wrap up, I just want to do a quick announcement and say that we now officially have a Discord for the channel. I'll have a link to it in the description and feel free to join. Anyway, I hope you guys found this video helpful and informative. If you did, please be sure to give it a like, comment, and subscribe, which tells me what types of videos you guys want to see. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video.